Hey everybody, you're watching Web Dev Junkie. My name is Cody Seibert, and in this video, I'm going to talk about a path to becoming a front-end web developer. So if you're on YouTube and you're subscribed to my channel, I'm assuming that you're trying to become a web developer or a better programmer in general, which is why you're online watching tutorials, learning how to code, etc. But one thing you may have noticed by now is that there are so many different people making resources and tutorials. There's boot camps, there's online paid for tutorials and stuff like that. And I think, oh, there's blog posts as well, and you got an actual like websites that help you with different stuff. But anyway, there's so many different ways to learn how to code that it can be a little bit overwhelming or daunting. And it's hard to actually find like what is the true path to most effectively or efficiently learning how to become a front end web developer. Okay. So I'm a full stack web developer. So I do front end, back end, and the database, and then DevOps, and CI/CD, and all this other stuff. But a small aspect of all that is obviously the front end, which, if you've heard React or Vue and other like Angular libraries like that, those are all associated with the front end. So what I have listed out here is a bullet point list of kind of like a path that can take you towards becoming a front end web developer, so that you can kind of stay on track and learn the essentials of what you need. This is obviously a really broad stroke. This isn't really granular in terms of like what you can learn, but starting from top to bottom, I think it's really important to make sure you learn all these things. So if you are brand new to front end development, you really can't just come in and start learning React, right? There's a lot of stuff that's happening in React under the hood that you need to understand. You can't just, I mean, technically you could start taking React and start using it and stuff like that, but it's kind of like being thrown on a bike and being told to ride when you haven't even been taught how, like, okay, what is a bike? How do the pedals work? How do the wheels work? How does balance work? Or learning how to run before you've even learned how to walk or crawl, right? React is a tool built upon JavaScript and front end like HTML and CSS that kind of facilitate people who already have a lot of knowledge with the fundamentals of front end web development and make it easier. So if you don't understand the fundamentals, you're doing yourself a disservice by just strictly learning React or Vue or Angular without learning the fundamentals. So that is why the first bullet point I have here is HTML. Now, HTML obviously is just markup, right? So that is this stuff. This is the DOM tree, the elements that kind of make up your page, and it's just a bunch of nested objects that have more nested objects and more nested objects. And depending on how you nest them and how you style them, it'll change how stuff shows up on the screen. So for example, if you look at github.com, this little black header is probably a div. So like, just to kind of show you, that could be a div with an ID of like header, not fib. Let me get rid of this. And I hope this tutorial is kind of helpful for an overview. But then just by looking at this, when you get really familiar with HTML, you can probably tell that, okay, so this little gray header here, the subheader, is probably another div that's alongside, so subheader. And inside of that header, you probably have more divs. So you have like an icon here. So nested inside the header, there's more than likely an image that's pointing to something for the icon. And then you have a search bar. So you probably have an input. So you notice how when you get really familiar with HTML, you can look at an existing page and you can start just like seeing the different components in your head and like understanding, okay, how is this thing built up? Could I replicate that? And that is kind of the first thing that I recommend is to learn HTML. Obviously, you can learn like the fundamentals by going through a tutorial, and I'll tell you like all the different DOM elements. You could use div, image, input, radio buttons, stuff like that. And it's good to learn those. But from my experience, what helps me the most is find a really simple website. So for example, the landing page of your Google search bar, if you're using Chrome, look how simple this site is, right? Find out by maybe even inspecting the code itself, inspect the DOM tree. If you right click on it and go to inspect element, sometimes this doesn't work. Sometimes pages are so convoluted in terms of code that it doesn't help to read through their code. But if you see here, they have a div that is used for the logo, and then nested As a sibling, you have another div for the search inbox. And inside that search inbox, you have, I don't know why they have fake box. It's kind of strange. They have like another div that has icons and it has a search input here and it has a button here. And you can actually go through here and see how the DOM tree is structured. And on your own, what I recommend doing is try to duplicate that. Try to replicate that on your own and build something that looks very similar to like Google or GitHub, or take a small component. Like take going back to this header, take this header and see if you can build that up with just HTML. Now, obviously, a lot of stuff you can't just use HTML for. You have to bring in CSS, so like to make the background color. But for the most part, you can make a functional header using like unordered lists here, maybe just divs with display inline block with like minimal CSS to get this looking pretty good. So obviously, yeah, the first thing of becoming a front-end web developer is HTML. And I recommend that you get a good solid foundation on HTML. Like you don't have to be a master at it, but like learn all the different DOM elements and learn how putting different things in different orders can either mess up your DOM tree or change how it looks, stuff like that. I should be able to move stuff and it should change. Wow. I don't know how this is laid up. They must have something going on behind the scenes where it's not like changing. Maybe it's like, oh, it's position absolute. So they have this stuff like absolute positioned. Um, but anyway, I could probably drag this above the logo, and it should put the search bar. It should put the search bar box, Burks, the search box up at the top. So you see how I can just drag around my DOM tree and like stuff changes. That's a good way to like understand how the DOM tree is working. But yeah, I recommend try to replicate stuff, play around with other people's sites, try to duplicate what they're doing. And then the next step, hopefully that was a good overview of HTML, but the next step was CSS, right? You need to have a good solid foundation on the cascading style sheet because HTML is only going to take you so far, right? You're not going to be able to change colors with HTML, like this hover effect. If you hover over one of these icons, you're changing the background color. So CSS obviously is just style. So I could just simply put like query selector and say like when I hover over my header, I want to change the background color to red or something. This is CSS, and this is really important for positioning even further your DOM elements, like adding padding between stuff, color when you hover and when you click, what happens when you highlight or when you click and drag stuff. There's ways to do like logic in CSS. I do not recommend it. I rather use JavaScript for anything that's logical, but you can hide DOM elements and do a lot of stuff with CSS. And again, I recommend just like learning the most basic and most fundamental CSS properties because there are a lot and it's kind of overwhelming. And again, the best way to do that is find a site and try to replicate either a small component of that site or let's see, Shopify. Let's say I go to Shopify and see like what does their site look like. Okay, so you have again another header. Can you replicate this with HTML and CSS? It has an image, it has some buttons, it has a green button, stuff like that. It has drop downs, which you can do in CSS if you want to, or you could use JavaScript for this. But again, I'm kind of just driving that point home. Like you could spend hours just watching tutorials of people explaining, okay, like this is margin left and it positions stuff to the left, or this is padding top and this is what it does. But that stuff's not really a great way to learn, in my opinion. I think it's better to find a page and explore for yourself, okay, like what can I do to make stuff have some padding? Like this probably has a padding of 20 and a padding of 20. If I just look at it, let's see what the padding is. So if I type padding as 1 EM, I don't really know what that is in pixels. So I mean, like even myself, I'll admit, there's a lot of stuff I don't really know. I usually use pixels for everything, which is probably not a good practice. Let's see, 1 EM to pixels. Oh wait, it said right there. I just want to see if I was right when I said 20 pixels. Because I'm like that. It's 16 pixels. Okay, so I was kind of close, I guess. So again, this has, padding, and this has padding, it has font size. And to give you like a basic list of the most important ones, you can get like 80-90% of the way by just learning about padding, margin, positioning, so like absolute, relative, fixed, stuff like that, background color, um, color, box shadow, or is it called drop shadow? I don't really know, but typically, like if you see like cards, like I think this has a box shadow, really really faint box shadow here. Let's see what else. Hover states, I guess, would be important with CSS, um, like this. These little, I don't know what these are called, sub attributes or actions or something. But in general, there's like a small list of like these properties that you should learn, and you could probably create 80 to 90% of all the websites you see just by learning like a couple of those things that I said. And the most important part of CSS are these selectors. So spend a lot of time learning about selectors. So what a selector is basically some type of string that tells your style sheet how to grab DOM elements. So for example, header means grab a DOM element that has an ID of header. So this little hash symbol means ID. And then let's say there is a nested component in here that you wanted to grab, such as the image. You could do a space and say image. So this is give me the ID of header, and then inside of that, give me an image, and then give me or apply a hover effect to it. If someone hovers over the image, do something. Or I could grab the input, or if I actually added like a class name to the inputs, I'll just say hello. I could say grab me the hello DOM element. So the DOM element that has a hello class, and do some hover on it. But yeah, this tutorial or this video isn't teaching CSS, so I'm not going to even dive into all that stuff. Just trying to outline that you need to learn the basic properties for styling. And like, again, I said padding, margin, position, colors, shadows. I don't know. Though you feel like you can get pretty far with just these. Oh wait, positioning would be like absolute, fixed, relative. I think this is probably the most important. Position is definitely the most important, and then padding and margin is just used for like changing how stuff looks. But anyway, and then of course you need to learn your selectors. This is the most important thing because you're going to be using that when you start learning about JavaScript, or at least the fundamentals of JavaScript. Okay, so once you've gotten a good idea of how to like pretty much replicate whatever site that you see, like if you can replicate any site, maybe like 80%, 90% all the way, I think you're good to move on to JavaScript. Like I would not recommend moving on to JavaScript until you learn how to just make a fixed page that looks similar to other pages. Because if you can't do this, then this is not going to be an easy route to achieve. All right, so now to the fun part, right? This is the probably the most daunting piece of knowledge that you're going to encounter when learning how to become a front-end developer, and this is JavaScript, right? Learning a programming language is not that easy. That's why there's full-blown paid college courses for learning how to become a programmer. There's online courses you pay for. There's boot camps to learn how to, learn JavaScript. And maybe that's just because they want to scam people, but I personally don't think learning to program is something that you can just do overnight. HTML and CSS, yes, I think you could probably learn this pretty well in a couple of weeks. But JavaScript, no. I think this takes months to actually become proficient at. And that is why I recommend that you don't learn it until you have a good understanding of this stuff. So to do the bare minimum in JavaScript, like again, if you look at some of these pages, like you could do a drop down in JavaScript to basically like add an event listener to when you click on one of these buttons, and basically show a div when you click on start, sell, or market, and then finally use JavaScript to even further do stuff when they click on these sub-nested lists, I guess. All right, so JavaScript is really useful for like adding interactivity to your web page, if you don't already know that. And you could do a lot of, cute little things in JavaScript without having to learn it, like the ins and outs. Here's another thing. This little X here. This is probably JavaScript. You click it, it probably either removes this DOM element from the page or adds like display none. Okay, so that is what JavaScript is for. In the path to learning JavaScript is not straightforward either. There's like hundreds of tutorials out there, but you need to learn the fundamentals. I could spell that, fundamentals, and that includes like variables. Oops. Variables, data types, looping, conditional logic. So looping would be like, I don't know, for loops, while loops, stuff like that. Conditional logic would be if statement, case or switch statements, I guess, like that. Ternary, I don't know if I spelled that right. What else are the fundamentals of JavaScript? I mean, basically any course that you find online that says like JavaScript for beginners, it's probably going to cover all of these fundamentals. Basic functions, not functionals. Let's see, variables, data types, looping, conditional logic, functions. I'm sure there's stuff I missed out. I'm just kind of glossing over this. And then there's also like the standard library stuff. So the standard library. So that includes like math.max or array.splice. Okay, so there is, I mean, man, you could probably spend months learning about all the different things in JavaScript. And I would recommend that you do. Like before you start learning how to use React or Vue or Angular, you need to be good at JavaScript. Right? You need to like not have to spend 10 minutes. If I were to go up to you and say, hey, I need you to write me like a loop that prints out all of the names in an array, right? You should be able to load up a new file and say names. You should be able to set up an array of like Bob and Jim, and then you should be able to like do a for each loop over that and do some type of a console log over the name. Okay, that is the proficiency that you should probably be before you start learning about React and Angular and Vue, at least in my opinion. That's just my opinion. If you feel like you want to tackle one of these frameworks that kind of abstract a lot of this stuff away from you, then, you know, do that. But there's like a lot of stuff that like even in React, this names.map, if you don't actually understand what's going on behind the scenes with like the map function and how it's returning like JSX DOM elements, then you're doing yourself a disservice. Like you need to understand these things before you start using a library or framework that kind of helps. Like the library is for helping you not have to write so much code or not have to do so much like DOM manipulation. But if you don't know how to do that in the first place, then you shouldn't be using it. Right? So another example, if I were to go up to you and say, hey, I need you to find like the minimum number in an array, right? That shouldn't take you more than like a couple of minutes to do, right? You should kind of know that in the back of your head. So like if I had numbers, you know, 5, 3, 1, negative 10, 5, or something like that, how would you find negative 20? How would you loop over this and find it? Well, you could probably do like a for loop or something else. Or if you know like how to do reduce, you could just say like current or min current. You could just loop over that and say return current less than min, then return current, otherwise return min, right? So that's how you find the minimum number. If I ran this code, it should print out negative 20. Now, I'm kind of just driving a point home. I'm exaggerating. It shouldn't, if you're a beginner, this should probably take you 30 minutes or more to like figure out. How do you loop through this and find the minimum? It's going to take you a lot of time to understand that. But what I'm getting at is like, if you're getting tripped up on like stuff such as this, like how to map over an array or loop over an array, don't move on to this yet. Okay. Don't move on to any of this yet. Don't start using new libraries and stuff. If you want to become a truly proficient front-end developer, then make sure you understand JavaScript. Now, a good way to learn JavaScript would to be like use some of these coding sites. So I think Code Wars is one or something. Let me go to this. I think Code Wars is one. But basically, it's a site that gives you a bunch of little practice like challenge problems for problem solving. Because I think problem solving is, again, one of the most important aspects of becoming a programmer. You need to know how to solve problems. And in order to solve problems, you need to solve a lot of problems yourself. Okay? Yourself, keyword, yourself. You need to sit there. There's times where I've tried to solve a problem. I'll spend literally 1, 2, 3 hours trying to figure something out. I'll search around, try to find answers. I don't find them. So I actually sit there and like try to think, what can I do to solve this problem? And I try different things. And finally, when I do figure it out, like that is the best way to like form those synapses in your brain and like learn how to problem solve properly. Because when you're programming and doing front end development, you're gonna run into issues where you spend like hours and then you finally realize that it's just like an off by one error or you forgot to add something correctly. And you got to learn how to like debug and do all this stuff. So problem solving, debugging is important, but you can't get debugging practice unless you do that problem solving. And it's hard to do problem solving unless people tell you problems to solve. So Code Wars, programming practice in JavaScript. I'm sure there's a lot of beginner related exercises. So JavaScript exercises, Edibit has JavaScript practice challenges. And I definitely suggest spending some time going through these very easy problems and make sure you understand how they work. You don't need to like become super expert at this. Like there's people who do this for fun, like full time, like doing competitive programming and stuff. But you should be able to at least do like the very easy or easies, or else you're just going to spend a lot of time like getting tripped up when you're using React or using some of these more powerful frameworks that you shouldn't be spending time on. Okay, so maybe that's not what you wanted to hear. Maybe you didn't want to hear spend like months learning JavaScript and learning how to problem solve. But that's the honest truth. You're not going to be a good front end developer unless you're just building static sites that have like really simple functionality. Then you don't need to learn that much JavaScript, right? You just need to know how to like, you know, manipulate the DOM. That's about it. Like, how do you do document.query selector and give me that header and then apply a style to it and say, make the top equal 20 pixels or something like that. Okay. You can do a lot of stuff just by this, like using JavaScript to change the style on the page or adding event listeners to stuff. So document.body.add event listener on click or something. So when you click on the page, do some other logic. But again, just this alone, like we have a function here. We have an anonymous function. We have a fat arrow. We have objects and properties of those objects. We have strings. So there's a lot of stuff that come from the fundamentals. Like this is a function that takes in a string that probably returns a DOM element that's an object that has style on top. And if you don't understand all that stuff behind the scenes, like you're just going to be spending a lot of time spinning your wheels trying to understand stuff because you haven't mastered the fundamentals. Okay, so I think let's take a breather. Let's stop. Let's take this all in. Let's do a recap. I don't want to discourage you, but again, static site, if that's all you're interested in, HTML, CSS all the way, boom, become good at this, and you can make some really awesome looking web pages, okay? Interactivity, if you want people to actually like interact with your app and have cool accordions and sliders and modals pop up and timers and all this other stuff, I highly recommend you get good at JavaScript. The better you get at this, the more you're opening yourself up to more career options, such as backend developer. You can move over to like Python development or any other type of programming development. Because once you've learned one programming language really well, it's super easy to jump over to another language, like Ruby, C Sharp, etc. Well, jumping from JavaScript to C Sharp is probably not straightforward because one's dynamic, one's static, but that's another topic. So yeah, those are the first. Obviously, the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are the most important. But once you feel like you have a good understanding, I'm not saying master them, but I'm saying like you shouldn't be fumbling around trying to remember how to declare a string in JavaScript, right? You shouldn't remember how to. You shouldn't have to look up documentation to figure out how to do an if statement in JavaScript. That should just come as like second nature. Um, so once you have a good understanding of all that, I would say move on to like a CSS library. There's something called Bootstrap or material components, etc., which basically gives you a lot of helper classes and styles that you can apply to your elements so that you don't have to write as much CSS, right? At this point, you probably have good fundamentals of CSS, so it's okay to use a library to help abstract some of that annoying stuff for you. Okay, so that's where I'm saying once you've understood CSS pretty well, bring in a library and see if that helps you quickly build like components. Like how do you build a card, right? You see this, you know how pages that have like a card that has a little bit of like shadow to it? Well, that's really just a div that has like a box shadow or maybe some padding and stuff like that. But once you've understand like, okay, this is a really simple CSS thing to build up, why not just use a library to build it for me? Because that'll save me some time. And sometimes libraries don't save you time. Sometimes you end up like having to hack around the way they've implemented their stuff because it doesn't match like what you want. But yeah, for the most part, if you've understood CSS, bring in a library and start learning that. And now it's time to like move on to more advanced topics. So like if you want to get down the path of npm or get down the path of using React, Vue, Angular, and Svelte or whatever single page application framework there is, you kind of need to be familiar with the terminal and also npm. So that's basically a package manager. We can bring in packages and run them locally or host them locally. Let's see, hosting a local web server. You can run like npx http server in a folder. So there's a lot of stuff that you could learn in this. I wouldn't say like become a master at this, but just know the basics of like how do you use npm? Maybe watch the tutorial. How to use your terminal? Watch the tutorial. Mainly for like CDing into different folders and stuff like that. And then obviously you're going to need to learn how to host a website if you just want to do like static web hosting for your index files. But at some point, if you've became pretty familiar with that, most web applications need to talk to like an API. So it's good to learn about AJAX requests. I don't know, REST API servers. Now I'm not necessarily saying like learn about how to write a REST API server, but how to communicate with one. So communicate with a REST API server, and that's like post, get, put, patch requests. So in the browser, like for example, when I type in, I don't know, on Google, when I type something in, type in hello, that's probably doing like a get request to a server, and then that gives me back some data, and then the UI refreshes and changes that. Okay, so this could probably be bundled with the JavaScript section, but you know, let me just bundle that with that. It's kind of important. It's really important, not kind of. Um, yeah. So once I think you have good familiar, when you're familiar with all the stuff above, that is the time when you say, okay, I understand how to do the fundamentals of JavaScript. I understand all the nitty gritty stuff of CSS and HTML and JavaScript. Now I want to use a library to help me manage and manipulate and update my DOM. Okay, so hopefully, if you've tried building web pages with vanilla JS, is what they say, you'll notice how tedious it is. You have to do the document.query selectors to get your DOM elements. You have to add event listeners. You got to manually change styles yourself. It's a lot of work, and you'll realize that people realize that it's a ton of work. It could become unmanageable. Your code becomes spaghetti. So that is why we have Angular and Vue and React, is to help facilitate writing single page applications or just web applications in general, so that we don't have to spend a lot of time doing all the nitty gritty stuff. Like that's taken care of us for us. All we have to do is just pretty much modify some data, and then our UI just updates automatically. It seems magical, but it's really simple behind the scenes. Like you could use like lit HTML or hyperdom, and there's other like low weight things you could use here. But yeah, so this is like when you reach this point and you have a basic understanding of React and all this stuff, like you're a pretty versed web developer, like front end web developer. And you could take most of these libraries and frameworks aren't that hard. Like they seem like they're a lot, but really by learning, like for example, let me take a breather. Whew, keep talking. So in React, really it's just like you have some hooks for making state, you got a hook for when your component mounts, and you have functional components for rendering out your DOM. Like that takes you like 70-80% of the way of building single page applications. And then of course like ES6 module imports is important as well, but you start realizing that like okay, these libraries, they seem daunting, but really there's just like a handful of things that you need to use to be able to accomplish most of everything. Um, let's see. I guess I could say like state management. It's like Redux or something, but that's not even that important. Like I won't even put it. But I think you could start diving into like other stuff like linting, Redux, state management, etc. Once you become good with React or other single page applications, then you could start diving into the other tools that people use when building like a React app. And this is like the bonus stuff, right? Just every once in a while you learn a new tool, see if it helps your programming. If it does, then bring it in. And then finally, building and deploying, right? So if obviously if you decide to not do this stuff yet, if you just want to learn HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you could just HTTP or FTP that up to a server like Apache, and then you're good to go, right? But at some point, when you start using these applications or these frameworks or libraries, you need to learn how to bundle them and deploy them, which isn't that daunting. I mean, there's tools that do that and tons of tutorials out there. And then you want to be able to host your static HTML files somewhere, right? So hosting, you got to learn how to upload to either like DigitalOcean, set up a Apache slash or Nginx on a DigitalOcean droplet, or if you wanted to use like Netlify, I think it's called, you could do that. Some other like CDN, like I don't know, S3 plus CloudFront, you could host your app there. Um, the choice is yours. The easiest thing is probably just set up a box, install Nginx, and copy your files there, or just use like GitHub pages. There's a lot of options here for hosting, but I think I'm gonna kind of wrap this video up because this has been going on for a while. But this is a path to become a front-end web developer. There's probably different ways you can achieve this. But again, let me just drive home my most important points is get good at HTML by replicating sites, and then start getting good at CSS by again replicating sites that you see. Try to rebuild the same sites on your own. You can watch tutorials along the way if you want to, but I think doing it yourself is the best way to learn. And then finally learn JavaScript and get really good at programming in JavaScript so that kind of opens up a lot of doors for you. If you want to like actually get into the industry or get a job, you're probably going to need to know how to program pretty well. All right, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns on this video or different suggestions or a different path to learning to become a front-end developer, be sure to leave a comment below. Otherwise, again, you've just finished watching a Web Dev Junkie video. My name is Cody Seibert, and thank you so much for watching.